Chapter 1. The Rumor with No Name. There is a particular kind of cruelty that never raises its voice. It does not shout. It does not shove. It simply closes a door so quietly that no one outside the room even hears the latch click, and the person inside is left to wonder, for years, whether the door was ever open to begin with. That was the cruelty Ivy Calder had lived inside for 3 years. The rumor had started small, the way rumors about 13-year-old girls always start small, in a whisper passed between 2 bunks in the dormitory after lights out. By the time it reached its full, monstrous shape, it did not need to be spoken aloud anymore. Everyone at Aldervane Academy simply knew it the way they knew the shape of the mountains outside the windows, the way they knew which staircases moved on Fridays and which professors could smell a lie before it left your mouth. They knew that Ivy had no animal inside her. Every wolf at Aldervane had a first shift. It came at 12, sometimes 13, a fever that broke into fur and bone, and came out the other side changed. Some students screamed through it. Some laughed. All of them, without exception, came out of that first night with claws they had not had the evening before, and a place in the pack they had not had the evening before either. It was not simply a rite of passage. It was proof. Proof that you belonged to the blood, to the sworn packs, to the old order of bonds that had ruled these mountains since before anyone could remember. Ivy had turned 12 in a narrow dormitory bed with her blanket pulled to her chin, waiting for the fever. It never came. She turned 13 the same way. 14. By the time she was 17, old enough that the other students had long since stopped waiting politely for her to catch up, the whispers had calcified into something worse than an insult. They had become a verdict. Empty. That was the word that followed her now, spoken so often it had lost its cruelty and become almost administrative, the way you might describe a house with no one living in it. No one shoved her into walls. No one wrote things on her door. It would have been easier in a strange way if they had, because at least then there would have been something to point at, something a professor could have punished. Instead, there was only the absence. The chair pulled a little too far from hers in the dining hall. The study groups that finished forming just as she walked into the room. The bonfires she was never told about until she saw the smoke rising from the ridge the next morning and understood, again, that she had not been wanted. She had gotten good at not looking for it anymore. That was its own kind of survival. So when Vesper Nightmare approached her on a gray Tuesday afternoon outside the East greenhouse, sunlight catching in her dark hair like something staged for a portrait, Ivy's first instinct was not hope. It was suspicion, sharp and immediate, the kind of animal wariness she was not supposed to have, and yet somehow did. "I've been thinking," Vesper said, in the easy, unhurried voice of someone who had never once in her life doubted that people would listen to her, that 3 years is a long time to hold a grudge over nothing. "I don't have a grudge," Ivy said. It was true. You could not have a grudge against people who had never bothered to give you a reason for one. You could only have a wound. Vesper smiled, and it was, infuriatingly, a beautiful smile. "Even better. Then there's nothing standing in the way of you coming to my house this weekend. Small gathering. Nothing formal. I want to fix whatever this is between us." She tilted her head, dark eyes catching the light. "Or is the rumor true, and you're afraid to be around people who might actually shift?" There it was. The hook, buried so precisely inside the invitation that Ivy felt it catch in her chest before she understood what it had caught on. She should have said no. She had every reason to say no. 3 years of quiet, catalogued evidence told her exactly what kind of evening waited for her behind that particular smile. And yet there is a hunger in a person who has been excluded for so long that it does not behave like caution. It behaves like thirst. Ivy heard herself say yes before she had finished deciding to, and some small, honest part of her recognized, even as the word left her mouth, that she had just walked willingly toward the edge of something. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I always love seeing which city or country you're watching from. The Nightmare Estate sat on a ridge above the Academy's western boundary, close enough that its lights were visible from the dormitory windows on clear nights, a constellation of wealth that had nothing to do with the stars. Ivy had seen it from a distance 100 times. She had never once imagined she would walk up its long gravel drive in a borrowed dress, her heart going too fast, telling herself this was fine, this was normal, this was just an ordinary Saturday night like the ones everyone else had been having without her for 3 years. She did not yet know that somewhere inside that house, a boy who had spent his whole life training himself not to notice anything at all was about to notice her. Liam Thornvale did not attend parties because he wanted to. He attended them because his family required his presence at anything that touched the Nightmare name and had required it since he was old enough to understand what an alliance was. He stood near the edge of most rooms out of habit rather than shyness, watching the way a person watches whether they cannot change, cataloging who spoke to whom, who postured, who lied. He had perfected the art of being present and absent at once, a body in the room and a mind somewhere far above it. He noticed the girl in the pale green dress the moment she stepped onto the terrace, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in an unpolished way that had nothing to do with the practiced glamour around her, but because she moved like someone bracing for impact. Every few seconds her eyes swept the crowd the way a soldier's might sweep a tree line. He recognized that particular vigilance. He had spent his whole life around people who wore masks. He knew what it looked like when someone had learned to survive by never fully relaxing. He did not know her name yet. He would, before the night was over, and he would not forget it again. For most of the evening, though, he simply watched from a distance, half listening to the conversations swirling around him about upcoming matches on the training pitch, about which family had secured which contract, about the particular scandal of a professor's rumored affair, none of it holding his attention the way the girl in the pale green dress did without ever once looking his way. He noticed the small habits that gave her away as an outsider among the crowd, the way she checked the nearest exit whenever a group's laughter rose too sharply, the way she held her glass without drinking from it, more prop than pleasure, a shield rather than an indulgence. He recognized those habits because he had built a version of them himself, over years of parties much like this one, though his own careful vigilance had calcified so thoroughly into performance that most people mistook it for ease. He thought, watching her, of the particular loneliness built into a place like Aldervane, where every friendship carried the quiet undertow of alliance, where even affection was rarely offered without some accompanying calculation of advantage. He had grown so accustomed to that undertow that he had nearly forgotten what it looked like when someone simply wanted, without agenda, to belong somewhere. Watching her circle the edges of the party, hopeful despite every sign that hope was misplaced here, stirred something in him he could not immediately name, some old, buried part of himself that remembered wanting the exact same thing at an age too young to understand, yet how rarely the world granted it freely. He almost approached her twice, and both times some old habit of caution held him back, the practiced instinct of a boy raised to weigh every interaction against its cost before allowing himself to act on it. He would spend the following weeks wishing, more than once, that he had simply crossed the terrace and introduced himself before the night curdled into the cruelty it eventually became. But some moments, he would come to understand, mattered less for when they happened than for what a person chose to do once they had. Chapter 2. The Blue Hour at Nightmare Manor. The pool behind the Nightmare house was the kind of thing built to be photographed rather than swum in, a long rectangle of black-bottomed water lit from beneath so that it glowed a deep, otherworldly blue in the dark, ringed by marble and strung overhead with lanterns that swayed gently in the mountain wind. Ivy stood near its edge for most of the evening, a glass of something she wasn't drinking held loosely in one hand, watching packs of students she had known for years talk and laugh, as though she were a stranger among them. She told herself this had been a mistake within the first 20 minutes. She told herself she would leave soon. Once she had spoken to Vesper properly, once she had proven to herself that she had not simply imagined an entire evening's worth of courage for nothing. That was the trouble with hope. It always asked you to wait 5 more minutes. Vesper found her near midnight, drifting through the crowd with the effortless gravity of a girl who had never once had to wonder if a room wanted her in it. "You came," she said, and there was something in her voice that Ivy, if she had been less desperate to believe in kindness, might have recognized as satisfaction rather than warmth. "I said I would. Walk with me." Vesper's hand found Ivy's shoulder, light, familiar, the kind of touch that looked, to anyone watching, exactly like affection. "I want you to meet a few people properly, not as the girl who never shifted, just as Ivy." For one unguarded moment, Ivy let herself want that so badly it ached. She did not see the boy behind her lift a glass of pale wine to distract the small circle of onlookers with a joke about the band. She did not see the brief, precise flick of Vesper's ankle, the toe of an expensive heel hooking behind her own, nor feel the faint pull of a whispered word, a small unraveling charm meant to steal balance for exactly the length of a held breath. She only felt the ground disappear. The fall lasted a handful of seconds and stretched, in her mind, into something much longer, a slow unraveling of sky and lantern light and the sudden, total absence of anything solid beneath her. Then the water took her, black and cold and utterly without mercy, closing over her head in a silence, so complete it felt like being erased. When she broke the surface, gasping, her dress plastered to her skin, and her hair a dark curtain across her face, the laughter had already started. It rippled outward from the group nearest the pool's edge in the particular cadence of laughter that has been waiting, that has been rehearsed, that knows exactly the shape it wants to take before the moment even arrives. Someone had a phone out. Someone else was narrating for the people who hadn't seen. Shame, Ivy would understand much later, cuts deeper than cold. The water numbed her skin within moments. It did nothing at all for the specific, searing humiliation of being watched, of being the evening's entertainment, of realizing that she had spent 3 years learning to survive quiet exclusion only to walk directly into something far louder and far crueler. And then, in the space of a single held breath, something else happened. It began beneath her skin, a current that did not belong to the pool at all, a tremor that moved up from someplace she had never known existed in her, a hollow she hadn't realized needed filling until it filled. Her eyes, though she could not see this herself, flooded silver, bright and strange in the low light, and beneath the surface of her arms something moved like moonlight caught in water, a shimmer with no source. On the black glass of the pool's surface, for one fractured second, something else looked back at the crowd. Not Ivy. Not entirely. A shape older than the shape of a girl, fluid and vast, and gone again before anyone could be certain they had seen it at all. The crowd, busy with their laughter and their phones, did not see it. They were looking at Ivy's humiliation, not at the water itself, and humiliation is a poor lens for noticing miracles. But Liam Thornvale, standing apart from the rest at the terrace's edge, had never once in his life looked away from anything he found strange. And what he saw in that pool was the strangest thing he had witnessed in 17 years of being told by every adult who had ever raised him, exactly what the world was and was not capable of. He did not think. He did not calculate what it would mean for his family's careful alliances if their heir was seen leaping fully clothed into a pool for a girl the entire academy had spent 3 years calling empty. He simply moved, jacket already falling from his shoulders, before his mind caught up to his body, and dove. The water was colder than he expected, a shock that cleared his head rather than clouding it. He found her in 3 strokes, her hands still moving with the panicked uncoordination of someone who had never been taught to trust water, and he wrapped one arm beneath hers and hauled them both toward the surface, toward the light, toward the edge where the laughter faltered into confused silence at the sight of him. He did not speak as he pulled her up onto the marble. He did not perform concern for the crowd the way he had watched adults perform sympathy at 100 functions before this one. He simply shrugged his own soaked jacket from his shoulders and settled it over hers, blocking, as much as fabric could, the dozens of eyes now turned their way, and said, low enough that only she could hear it. "Can you stand?" Ivy could not answer immediately. Her teeth were chattering, her whole body caught in the aftershock of cold and shame and something else she had no name for yet, a hum beneath her skin that had not fully quieted. She nodded anyway, because nodding felt safer than admitting she wasn't sure. Liam did not wait for the crowd's attention to move elsewhere. He simply turned his back on all of it, one hand steady at her elbow, and walked her toward the house, toward warmth, toward whatever quiet corner he could find that had not yet been claimed by the party's noise. Chapter 3. What the Water Remembers. The room Liam found was a small sitting room off the west hallway, rarely used, its furniture draped in pale covers that made it look half asleep. He found a folded blanket in a linen closet and a set of dry clothes that must have belonged to his younger cousin, still tagged with a name Ivy didn't recognize, and left them on a chair without ceremony, along with a towel, before stepping back out into the hallway to give her privacy. She changed with shaking hands, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders afterward, though the shivering had less to do with cold now than with the aftershock of everything else. When she opened the door again, he was leaning against the opposite wall, arms crossed, waiting the way someone waits who has decided, without being asked, that they are not going anywhere. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I know." He studied her for a moment, and there was nothing pitying in the look, which surprised her more than the rescue itself had. Pity she was used to deflecting. This was something closer to attention, undiluted and slightly unsettling in its directness. What was that? In the water? Ivy's stomach dropped. She had hoped, in the chaotic seconds after she was pulled out, that whatever had happened to her had gone unnoticed, buried beneath the crowd's cruelty. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way you might point out a fact neither of you had chosen, but both of you now had to live with. "I saw your eyes. I saw the water. I've been at this academy my whole life. I know every shifter bloodline that's ever walked these halls, and I have never seen anything that looked like that." She wanted to lie. Lying would have been so much easier than admitting, out loud, to a boy she had spoken maybe 10 words to before tonight, that something had happened inside her that she could not explain, could not control, and was more afraid of than she had ever been of the 3 years of quiet cruelty that preceded it. But something about the steadiness in his face made lying feel pointless. "I don't know what it was," she admitted. "I've never shifted. Not once. Everyone thinks there's nothing in me. And then tonight there was water, and it was cold, and something just..." She stopped, unable to find the word. Woke up. Liam was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, as though the walls of the manor might be listening. "Don't tell anyone else what you told me. Not a professor, not a friend, not anyone. Not until I understand what I saw." "Why does it matter to you?" It was a fair question, and she watched him search for an answer that wasn't simply instinct, because instinct was not something people like Liam Thornvale were raised to trust. "Because," he said finally, "in this house, tonight, in front of everyone who matters to my family's alliances, I just did something no one is going to let me pretend didn't happen. And I want to know why I did it." It was not romantic. It was not even particularly warm. But it was honest, and honesty was a currency Ivy had not been offered in longer than she could remember, and something in her chest, already raw from the night's humiliation, cracked open a little further at the plainness of it. They did not talk much more that night. He walked her to the edge of the property when a car arrived to take students back to the academy, and at the door he said only, "Be careful," in a tone that suggested he meant it in a way that went beyond ordinary courtesy, though neither of them could yet have said exactly what he was warning her against. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake in her narrow dormitory bed, running her fingers over her own arms, searching for some remnant of the strange, silver shimmer she had felt beneath her skin, finding nothing but ordinary skin, ordinary bone, and the specific, exhausted ache of a girl who has just discovered that the thing everyone called empty in her was never empty at all. It had simply been waiting for water she had never had reason to touch. In the days between the party and that first attempt on her life, something small but unmistakable had already begun shifting in the ordinary rhythm of the academy, though Ivy barely noticed it at the time, too absorbed in her own private reckoning to register the change happening around her. Vesper Nightmare, for reasons Ivy did not yet understand, had gone strangely quiet, no longer holding court at the center of her usual crowd with the same easy cruelty, watching Ivy sometimes from across the dining hall with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite curiosity, but something uneasy caught between the two. Ivy spent those first days mostly alone, turning the memory of the pool over and over in her mind the way you might turn a stone you weren't sure was actually as strange as you remembered it being. She tested small things in private, cautious and half ashamed of her own hope. She held her hands beneath the tap in the dormitory bathroom late at night, willing something to happen, and felt nothing but ordinary water against ordinary skin. She stood at her window during the full moon and waited, breath held, for the tremor she'd felt at the party to return, and was met only with the silence of an unremarkable night. Whatever had woken inside her did not answer to wanting. It answered, apparently, to something else entirely, something she did not yet have the language to name. She thought, more than she wanted to admit, about the way Liam had looked at her in that hallway outside the sitting room, without pity, without the careful, managed sympathy she had grown so used to deflecting from the few people who occasionally offered it. She told herself it meant nothing, that a boy who had grown up destined for someone else's hand had no business occupying this much of her attention, and she mostly believed herself, in the daylight at least. It was only in the quiet hours before sleep that she allowed herself to wonder what it might be like to be looked at that way more than once. She did not seek him out again in those first days, some old, careful instinct telling her that whatever had passed between them at Nightmare Manor was too fragile, too easily misread, to test so soon. It was Liam, in the end, who found a reason to seek her out first, appearing at the edge of the courtyard 3 days after the party with a folded scrap of paper in his hand, and an expression that suggested he had been debating, for some time, whether to hand it over at all. "I did some reading," he said, without preamble, holding out the paper. "After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw." She unfolded it carefully. A short list of names, half of them crossed out, notes scrawled in careful handwriting beside a few remaining entries. Bloodlines associated, however loosely, with water magic in the old records. None of them matched cleanly with what she had felt at the pool, but it was, she understood, an offering all the same, proof that he had spent 3 nights of his own time trying to make sense of a stranger's impossible secret instead of simply forgetting it the way anyone with less reason to care might have. "You didn't have to do this," she said again, echoing her words from the hallway, though this time there was less disbelief in it and more quiet gratitude. "I know," he said, and something in the small, crooked way he said it told her he had grown tired of hearing himself say it too. "I wanted to anyway." It was a small exchange, barely a conversation at all, but it planted something between them that would grow, over the following weeks, into the fragile, dangerous alliance that would eventually upend a century of carefully guarded secrets. Neither of them yet understood how close that alliance would come to costing them everything. 3 days later, someone tried to kill her for the first time. Chapter 4. A Crack in the Corridor. The east corridor of Aldervane's old wing was rarely used after dark, a narrow passage lined with stone reliefs, so old their carved faces had worn nearly smooth, connecting the newer dormitories to the library's restricted annex. Ivy cut through it most nights because it was quiet, because it was one of the few places in the academy where she did not have to arrange her face into practiced indifference, and because, until that Thursday night, she had never had reason to think it dangerous. She heard the sound before she understood it, a low groan of stone shifting somewhere above her, and some instinct older than thought threw her sideways a half-second before a block of carved granite the size of a washing machine came down exactly where she had been standing, shattering against the floor in a spray of dust and stone fragments that peppered her arms and face. For a long moment, she simply lay against the wall where she had thrown herself, ears ringing, heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat, staring at the wreckage of what would have been her skull. The Academy's investigation, when it came the next morning, was brief and unconvincing. A structural fault, the maintenance staff said. Old stonework, old mortar, nothing anyone could have predicted. Ivy nodded along because there was nothing else to do. Because who would believe that anyone had a reason to want a girl everyone called empty dead, and because some cold, newly awakened part of her recognized, even as she nodded, that the explanation was a lie. She noticed the burnt smell only after the maintenance crew had already cleared most of the rubble, a faint, acrid trace clinging to the stone near where the block had been dislodged. The specific scent of a binding charm burned through at the moment of release. She had grown up around fishermen, not sorcerers, but even she knew the difference between an accident and a trigger. Liam found her outside the library an hour later, and she did not need to tell him what had happened. He had already heard. Structural fault, he repeated, in a voice that made clear exactly how much he believed that phrase. Show me your arms. She held them out without asking why, and he turned them gently in the corridor light, examining the small cuts left by flying stone with a focus that had nothing to do with the wounds themselves and everything to do with what they represented. This wasn't an accident, he said. I want you to tell me exactly where you were standing and exactly what made you move. I don't know. Something just told me to. His jaw tightened. That's not nothing. That's your instincts trying to keep you alive. He looked up and down the empty corridor, his voice dropping. Someone wanted you under that stone. And whoever it was near schedule well enough to know you'd be walking through here alone at this hour. The idea should have terrified her more than it did. Perhaps she had simply run out of room for new fear after 3 years of quieter cruelties. What she felt instead, standing there with a boy she barely knew examining her arms with more care than anyone had shown her in years, was something closer to clarity. Someone thought she was worth killing, which meant someone thought she was worth something at all. A thought so foreign to the story she had told herself about her own life that it nearly made her laugh, bitterly, at the strangeness of finally mattering to someone through the thread of her own death. You think this has to do with what happened at the pool, she said. I think, Liam said carefully, that whatever woke up in you that night is not something the people who run this academy would want walking around unaccounted for. I think there are people here, people with real power, who would rather see you dead than see you understand what you are. And you don't want that. He looked at her directly then, something in his expression she had not yet learned to read. No, he said simply. I don't. It was not a declaration. It was barely even a promise. But it was the first time in 3 years that someone had looked at Ivy Calder and decided, without needing to be convinced, that her survival mattered. From that night on, without either of them naming it, an alliance began to take shape between them, quiet as the corridor they'd nearly died in, and twice as dangerous to admit to. Chapter 5. The Silence Between Enemies. The restricted annex of Aldervane's library was not, technically, forbidden to students, only heavily discouraged, guarded by a system of locks that responded to bloodline rather than key, and populated by texts so old their spines had been rebound more times than anyone could count. Liam's name opened doors Ivy's never would have, a fact neither of them commented on, though it sat uncomfortably between them each time he murmured a password to a door that simply would not have acknowledged her at all. They began meeting there after curfew, twice a week, then 3 times, an arrangement that made sense only because both of them had run out of safer options. Ivy needed answers. Liam, though he would not have admitted it easily, needed to understand why he had jumped into that pool without thinking, Why he kept finding reasons to seek out a girl his entire upbringing had trained him to overlook. Their first real find came almost by accident, buried in a genealogical record so old the ink had faded to the color of weak tea. A single line, easy to miss among hundreds of others, referencing a bloodline, dissolved by council decree, records sealed, existence undocumented by royal order. No explanation. No names. Only a date nearly 90 years old and the faint suggestion, in the deliberate blankness that followed, of a story someone had worked very hard to erase. Someone doesn't just seal a bloodline's records for no reason, Liam said, running a finger along the brittle page, without quite touching it. This isn't neglect. This is erasure. Someone wanted this line forgotten on purpose. You think this is what I am. I think, he said, that whatever you saw in the water that night didn't come from nowhere. Every shifter bloodline in these mountains is documented, catalogued, proud of its history. This is the only gap I've ever found. And gaps like this don't happen by accident. They worked in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that used to feel awkward between them and now, unexpectedly, felt companionable. Ivy found herself watching him sometimes when he wasn't looking, noting the careful, deliberate way he handled the old pages, as though respect for fragile things was simply built into him rather than performed. It was strange to reconcile this version of him with the aloof, unreachable heir the rest of the academy seemed to know, the boy destined, everyone said, to marry Vesper Nightmare and bind two of the strongest packs on the continent into one. Why do you help me? She asked once, quietly, not looking up from the page in front of her. You have nothing to gain from this. Everything to lose, if anyone found out. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. I've spent my whole life doing what was expected of me, he said finally. Every friendship, every alliance, every future I've ever imagined for myself has been decided by someone else before I was old enough to have an opinion about it. You're the first thing in 17 years I've chosen because I wanted to, not because someone told me I had to. The admission sat between them, fragile as the old pages spread across the table, and Ivy found she did not know what to do with the warmth it stirred in her chest. Warmth she had spent 3 years teaching herself not to expect from anyone. It was easier, in some ways, to focus on the mystery than on what was growing quietly beside it. They found more fragments over the following weeks, each one small, each one deliberately incomplete, as though someone long ago had gone through every record in this library with careful, patient hands, removing anything that might let a future reader reconstruct the whole truth. A name here, cut off mid-sentence. A page there, replaced with blank paper so precisely matched in age that only close inspection revealed the substitution. Someone had worked very hard, for a very long time, to make sure no one would ever find what Ivy and Liam were now determined to find anyway. The annex itself, Ivy came to learn over those quiet weeks, held more than just the mystery she and Liam were chasing. It held the entire architecture of the world she had grown up inside without ever understanding its shape. She had known, in the vague, half-formed way most students knew things they'd been taught since childhood, that the packs of the continent traced their authority back to the founding of the bond centuries ago, that each bloodline held its own territory, its own customs, its own particular relationship to the moon and the change it brought. She had not known, until those long nights in the annex, quite how deliberately that history had been curated, how many inconvenient details had been quietly smoothed away in favor of a simpler, more flattering story. She learned that the old kingdoms which had once ruled these mountains before the packs consolidated their power had kept their own courts, their own rivalries, their own uneasy truces with the shifting bloodlines living at their borders, alliances sealed not through magic, but through marriages and treaties that read, in the old records, more like exhausted compromises than grand romances. She learned that the creatures the modern academy taught about in careful, sanitized lecture halls, the great drakes that still nested in the northern peaks, the pale, Long-limbed things that were said to move through fog at the edges of old battlefields had once been woven far more intimately into the daily lives of these mountains than anyone at Aldervane now seemed to remember. History, she was beginning to understand, was rarely erased all at once. It was worn away slowly, generation by generation, each retelling losing a little more texture, until what remained was smooth and simple and safe enough to teach to children. "Do you ever wonder," she asked Liam one night, turning a brittle page with careful fingers, "how much of what we're taught is actually true? Not lies, exactly. Just softened. Trimmed down until it fits." He considered the question longer than she expected. "I used to think the old stories were just stories," he admitted. Dragons that answered to certain bloodlines. Academies with their own quiet rivalries between houses, the way ours still does, though no one really remembers why anymore. I always assumed that was just decoration. Now I'm not so sure any of it was ever just decoration. They fell into an easy rhythm during those weeks, one Ivy would look back on later as some of the only genuinely peaceful evenings of that entire year. Liam would arrive first, usually, securing the annex's temperamental locks before she slipped in through the side corridor, and they would work in companionable silence for an hour or more before either of them spoke. The quiet between them no longer awkward, but something closer to comfortable. He teased her, occasionally, about her handwriting, cramped and slanted in the margins of her notes, and she teased him back about the careful, formal way he still addressed even the oldest, most disintegrating texts, as though etiquette applied to books as much as people. It was, she realized slowly, the first real friendship she had built in 3 years, and the fact that it had grown out of danger rather than in spite of it did nothing to diminish how much she had come to treasure it. There were nights, too, when the research gave way to quieter conversation, when Liam spoke haltingly about the particular loneliness of being raised as an heir, trained since childhood to read every room for advantage rather than warmth, and Ivy found herself, in turn, telling him things about the fishing village she'd grown up in that she had never told anyone at the academy, the smell of salt and tar in the mornings, the particular quality of light on the water at dawn that she had missed. Every single day since arriving at Aldervane, neither of them named what was growing between them in those quiet hours. Both of them, in their own private ways, had already begun to understand it wasn't only the mystery of her bloodline keeping them returning to that annex, night after night, long after either of them strictly needed to. And somewhere in the Academy's administrative wing, in a council chamber neither of them had ever set foot inside, people who had spent decades maintaining that same careful silence were beginning to notice that a girl who was never supposed to matter had started asking exactly the wrong questions. Chapter 6. The Weight of Inheritance. Vesper Nightmare had not become the girl she was by accident. From the moment she could walk, she had been taught, in careful and relentless ways, that her value lay in the alliance she would one day complete, that her name meant nothing on its own except as half of a future equation involving the Thornvale bloodline. She had learned to smile at dinners she had no interest in attending, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to treat every social gathering as a rehearsal for the marriage everyone had already decided on for her before she'd had a single say in the matter. It would have been easy to imagine Vesper as nothing more than the polished, cruel girl who had orchestrated Ivy's humiliation at the pool, and for most of the academy, that imagining was more than sufficient. But cruelty, Liam had learned over years of watching her from the particular vantage point of a boy who was supposed to love her one day whether he wanted to or not, was rarely simple. It was, more often, the shape fear took when it had nowhere else to go. He found her alone in the East Garden one evening, sitting on the edge of an old stone fountain with her arms wrapped around her knees in a posture so unlike her usual composed elegance that he nearly didn't recognize her from a distance. "You've been avoiding me," she said without looking up as he approached. "Ever since the party. I've been busy. With her." It wasn't an accusation, not quite. It was something closer to exhaustion. "Everyone's talking about it, Liam. The heir of Thornvale, jumping into a pool for the empty girl. Do you have any idea what my mother said to me the morning after?" He sat down beside her, keeping a careful distance, the way you might sit beside something you weren't sure was safe to touch. I don't particularly care what your mother said. You should. Vesper's voice cracked slightly, the first genuine emotion he had heard from her in longer than he could remember. You think this is easy for me? You think I want to marry a boy who looks at me like I'm a business arrangement he's stuck with? I didn't choose this any more than you did. I've just had longer to make peace with it. Liam realized with a discomfort he hadn't expected, the most honest conversation he and Vesper had ever had. Then why the party? Why humiliate her like that? Vesper was quiet for a long moment, staring at the dark water of the fountain. Because for the first time in 3 years, someone in this academy had less power than I did, she said finally, so quietly he nearly missed it. And it felt good to remember what that was like. To not be the one everyone was watching, waiting for me to fail at being perfect. She looked up at him, and there was something raw in her expression that he had never seen there before. That doesn't make it right. I know that. But I need you to understand it wasn't really about her. He didn't forgive her for it, not entirely, not yet. But he understood, in a way he hadn't before, that Vesper Nightmare was as trapped by the expectations built around her as he was by his own. 2 pieces on the same board neither of them had chosen to sit at. I'm not going to marry you, he said, gently as he could manage, though there was no gentle way to say it. Not because of Ivy. Because of both of us. Neither of us should have to spend our whole lives paying for a decision our parents made before we were born. Something in Vesper's face shifted, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular loosening that comes when a burden you've carried so long you forgot it was optional is finally set down. My mother won't accept that. I know. His jaw tightened. Neither will mine. But that doesn't make it less true. Neither of them noticed, in that private, unguarded moment in the garden, the figure watching from an upstairs window of the manor, a woman with Liam's same sharp eyes and none of his newfound conscience, filing away everything she had just overheard with the cold, patient calculation of someone who had spent decades protecting a secret far larger than her son's love life. Vesper sought Ivy out herself, unexpectedly, a few days after that conversation in the garden, finding her in the quiet corner of the courtyard where Ivy had taken to eating lunch alone since the incident at the pool had made the dining hall feel unbearable in new and different ways. She did not sit down uninvited. She stood a careful distance away, arms crossed, an expression on her face that looked almost nothing like the girl who had orchestrated Ivy's humiliation weeks earlier. I'm not here to apologize prettily, Vesper said, without preamble. I don't think you'd believe me if I tried, and honestly, I'm not sure I'd believe myself either. But I wanted you to hear it from me directly instead of secondhand. What happened at the pool was cruel, and it was mine to own, and I'm not going to pretend some excuse about pressure makes it something other than what it was. Ivy studied her for a long moment, wary in the particular way 3 years of quiet exclusion had trained her to be wary of sudden kindness. Why now? Because Liam told me what he saw in that water. Vesper's voice dropped, some of her usual composure slipping. And because I've spent my whole life being told my worth depends entirely on an alliance I never chose, and watching you refuse to accept the same kind of cage without a fight made me realize how long I've stopped even trying to fight mine. She looked away, toward the mountains beyond the courtyard wall. I'm not saying we're going to be friends. I don't expect that, and I wouldn't blame you for never trusting me again. I just didn't want to keep pretending that night was nothing when I know exactly what it cost you. It was not forgiveness, not yet, not fully. But it was, Ivy recognized, an honest reckoning offered without an audience to perform it for, and that honesty was worth something even if the wound behind it hadn't finished healing. Thank you for saying it, Ivy said carefully. I'm not ready to call it settled. But thank you. Vesper nodded, accepting the boundary without argument, and turned to leave before pausing at the courtyard's edge. For what it's worth, she added, not quite looking back, whatever's happening between you and Liam, I hope it's real. He spent his whole life being told exactly who to become. He deserves to choose something himself for once. And then she was gone, leaving Ivy alone with a complexity she hadn't expected to feel toward the girl who had once seemed, to her, like the simplest kind of enemy the world could offer. The weeks that followed carried their own quiet momentum, the strange, cautious alliance between Ivy and Liam deepening into something neither of them examined too closely for fear of what naming it might change. There were small things Ivy noticed and did not comment on. The way he began saving her a place without being asked whenever their research kept them working late enough to need a meal brought up from the kitchens. The careful attention he paid whenever she flinched at some fresh cruelty from students who hadn't yet softened toward her the way Vesper had. There were things Liam noticed in turn. The particular stubborn set of her jaw whenever she refused to let 3 years of exclusion make her smaller than she was, the quiet, fierce curiosity with which she approached every new fragment of her own history, refusing, even in grief, to let fear make her flinch away from the truth. Elira Thornvale had not risen to her position on the council by allowing sentiment to interfere with necessity. And she had very particular reasons her son knew nothing about, for wanting the girl called Ivy Calder to disappear as quietly and completely as the bloodline she was only just beginning to understand she belonged to. Chapter 7. The name erased from history. It was Liam who finally found the word, 3 weeks into their search, tucked inside a footnote of a footnote in a treatise, so obscure it had clearly not been opened in decades, its pages stiff with disuse. Miranai. A single reference, unadorned by explanation, in a passage discussing the founding of what the old texts called simply the bond, the ancient magic that had, centuries ago, woven the shifter packs of the continent into a single interlocking structure of loyalty and inherited power. The bond has never been undone, the passage read, in language stiff with age, save by the hand of a Miranai, whose blood answers to water and moon rather than to blood and pack, and who alone among all born beneath these mountains may loosen what has been tied. Ivy read the line 4 times before she trusted herself to speak. "That's me," she said. "Isn't it? That's what happened at the pool." Liam nodded slowly, his expression unreadable in the low lamplight of the annex. "Water and moon," he repeated. "Not will. Not discipline. Everyone else who shifts learns to control it eventually, through practice, through training. But if this is right, your power was never something you were supposed to be able to control the way the rest of us do. It only wakes when the conditions are right. Water. Moonlight. Nothing you can force. Then why hide it? Why erase an entire bloodline from history over something that sounds, if anything, rare rather than dangerous?" Liam turned the page carefully, revealing another line, half of it lost to a water stain that had clearly not been accidental. Because if a Miranai exists, it means the bond itself was never permanent, never absolute the way every pack leader on this continent has always claimed. It means their power was always something that could be undone. Do you understand what that means for people who've built their entire authority on the idea that the bond is unbreakable? Ivy sat back slowly, the pieces settling into a shape she did not want to see and could not stop seeing anyway. They couldn't let people know a Miranai existed, because it would mean admitting their power was never as absolute as they claimed. So instead of banning them, or hunting them openly, which would have proven the same point, Liam said, they just made sure no one ever knew there was anything to hunt. Quiet deaths. Accidents. Records sealed, not burned, because burning them would have raised questions. Just erased, slowly, patiently, until the name Miranai became something people assumed was a myth, if they'd heard it at all. The word hung between them, heavier now than it had been a moment before. Ivy thought of her mother, a woman she had never known, whose absence had always simply been labeled lost, a word that had never once, in 17 years, struck her as strange until this exact moment. "My mother," she said slowly. What if she wasn't lost? What if she was Miranai too, and someone made sure she disappeared before anyone could ask why? Liam did not try to soften the possibility, and she was grateful for that more than she could have said. "I think," he said carefully, "that's exactly what happened. And I think whoever arranged it is still here. Still watching. Still protecting whatever version of history keeps them safe." Ivy pressed her palms flat against the old wooden table, steadying herself against a truth that had just rearranged the entire shape of her life. She had spent 17 years believing she had been abandoned, unwanted, a mistake no one had cared enough to explain. And now, in the space of a single sentence, that story had cracked open to reveal something far crueler and far more deliberate underneath it. She had not been abandoned. She had been hidden, protected, in the only way someone desperate and powerless against a council could manage, by disappearing her into an ordinary life so thoroughly that not even she would know what she was. "Someone chose to hide me," she said quietly, testing the shape of the thought aloud. "Someone who knew what I was, and knew it would get me killed if anyone found out." Liam reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it anyway. "Then we find them," he said. "Whoever hid you. Whoever is still trying to make sure you disappear the same way your mother did. We find them before they find you first." They spent the following nights piecing together what fragments remained of the Miranai's older history, working backward from the single surviving reference until they had assembled something closer to a full picture. The old text described the bond not as a single spell but as a living architecture, renewed generation after generation through rituals so old their origins had blurred into myth, binding pack to pack, leader to lineage, in a lattice of obligation that had, over centuries, hardened into something indistinguishable from law. To break even a single thread of that lattice, the text suggested, was to risk unraveling threads far beyond the one directly touched, which explained, more clearly than anything else they had found, why a single surviving Miranai had once been considered dangerous enough to justify a century of quiet, deliberate erasure. "It's not really about you being dangerous to any one person," Liam said one night, staring at a diagram of interlocking circles that some long-dead scholar had rendered with obsessive precision across 2 full pages. "It's that you're dangerous to the entire structure. If people understood the bond could be undone, they'd start asking why it should hold at all, whether the packs at the bottom of that lattice ever actually consented to the obligations at the top of it." Ivy studied the diagram, tracing the careful lines with her eyes, feeling the shape of an old, uncomfortable truth settling into place. "So my mother wasn't hunted because she was a threat to one family," she said slowly. "She was hunted because she was a threat to the entire idea that any of this had to stay the way it's always been. That's the one thing my mother's faction understood better than most," Liam said grimly. "It was never really about you, or your mother before you. It's about making sure no one below the council ever has proof that things could be different." The realization settled over both of them with a weight that neither research nor careful preparation could fully soften. Ivy thought of the whispered rumors that had followed her through 3 years of quiet exclusion. Empty, the word that had once felt like the cruelest possible judgment anyone could pass on her. She understood now that the word had never been about her at all. It had been the shape fear took when it needed somewhere safe to hide, a century-old anxiety about the fragility of power dressed up as a schoolgirl's insult. "I keep thinking about all the other Miranai who might have come before her," Ivy said quietly. "How many of them there might have been, quietly erased, one generation after another, until almost no one even remembered the name well enough to be afraid of it anymore." Liam reached across the table, closing his hand gently over hers where it rested against the old diagram. "Then that ends with you," he said. "Whatever happens next, they don't get to erase this one quietly. Not while I have any say in it." It was, Ivy would think later, one of the first moments she allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that she was not facing this alone, that the boy beside her had chosen, deliberately and at real cost to himself, to stand inside the danger with her rather than watch it from a comfortable distance, the way his upbringing had trained him to do with everything that threatened the careful order of his world. Neither of them yet knew how close that search would bring them to Liam's own family, nor how much it would cost them both before the truth finally surfaced into the light neither the council nor the centuries of careful silence had ever intended it to reach. Chapter 8. Poison in the Old Wing. The second attempt came so close to succeeding that Ivy did not fully understand it had happened until she woke in the Academy's small infirmary 2 days later, her throat raw, her limbs heavy in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary tiredness. She remembered fragments. The particular sweetness of the tea in her dormitory that night, sharper than usual, a taste she had noticed and dismissed because dismissing small wrongness was a habit she had built over years of not wanting to seem paranoid. She remembered the room tilting. She remembered, distantly, a hand at her back guiding her toward the door, a voice she didn't recognize telling her she needed air, and then nothing at all until the sterile white of the infirmary ceiling swam into focus above her. Liam had been the one to find her collapsed in the corridor outside her dormitory, unconscious, her lips already tinged faintly blue, and it was only the particular quickness of his instincts, the same instincts that had thrown him into a pool without thought weeks earlier, that had gotten a healer to her in time. The physician who treated her, an older woman with tired eyes and the kind of caution that comes from decades of not asking questions she wasn't paid to ask, identified the poison eventually as a rare compound derived from silverroot, a plant valuable primarily because it left almost no trace in the body within a day of administration. Whoever did this, the healer told Liam quietly, when she believed Ivy was still asleep, knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't the kind of poison a jealous classmate finds by accident. This is council-grade work. Liam's hands, when Ivy finally woke and found him sitting at her bedside, were clenched so tightly around the arm of his chair that his knuckles had gone white. "I should have been watching more closely," he said, before she could speak. "I knew someone was trying to kill you. I let myself think we had more time. This isn't your fault." Her voice came out cracked, unfamiliar even to her own ears. "You didn't poison my tea."
No.
"But I know who has access to silverroot compounds refined enough to leave no trace." His jaw was tight, his eyes distant in a way that told her he was working through something he did not want to be working through. "It's not a common plant. It grows in exactly one place near here, on council-protected land. Whoever did this had access that ordinary students, ordinary staff, do not have." The implication sat between them, heavy and unwelcome. "You think it's someone close to the council," she said slowly. "Someone with real power." "I think," Liam said, and something in his voice had gone careful in a way she hadn't heard from him before, "that we need to be more careful about who we trust from here on." She noticed, though she said nothing about it yet, that he had not been able to look at her directly when he said it, and some quiet, uneasy part of her filed the observation away for later, unsure yet what it meant, only certain that it meant something. Her recovery took the better part of a week, days spent mostly in the narrow infirmary bed with Liam visiting between classes, bringing books from the restricted annex disguised beneath ordinary schoolwork, continuing their research in careful, quiet increments even as the danger around them sharpened into something neither of them could ignore any longer. It was during one of these visits, on a gray afternoon with rain streaking the infirmary windows, that Ivy finally asked the question she had been avoiding since the poisoning. "Do you think it's someone in your family?" Liam did not answer immediately, and his silence told her more than any words could have. "I don't know," he said finally, and the honesty in it cost him something visible, a small crack in the composure he had spent his whole life perfecting. "My mother sits on the council. She has access to protected land, protected records, protected everything. I've spent my whole life believing she was simply strict, simply traditional. I've never once had reason to think she was capable of arranging someone's death. And now I don't know what to believe." He rubbed a hand over his face, and for a moment he looked younger than she had ever seen him, stripped of the composure that had always made him seem older than 17. I keep thinking about the timing. The stone in the corridor happened days after the party, after everyone saw what happened at the pool. The poisoning happened the same week we found the reference to the Miranai bloodline in the annex. Someone knows exactly what we're finding, almost as quickly as we're finding it. The thought settled over both of them, like a physical weight. Someone close enough to the investigation to track its progress in real time. Someone with access to council land, council records, council secrets old enough to have survived nearly a century of careful concealment. The list of people who fit that description was not long, and Ivy watched Liam arrive, silently, at the same terrible possibility she had already reached. If it is her, Ivy said carefully, "What happens to you?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know what happens to you if we stop looking. And I'm not willing to let that happen just to protect my own comfort." He met her eyes then, steady despite everything churning beneath the surface of his composure. "Whatever this costs me, Ivy, I'd rather know the truth and lose everything than keep pretending I don't see what's right in front of me." She would realize much later, the moment she stopped thinking of him as an ally of convenience and started, quietly, dangerously, to think of him as something else entirely. Something she had no roadmap for, no experience navigating, and no intention, despite every instinct telling her to be careful, of turning away from. Once Ivy was well enough to leave the infirmary, she and Liam grew more careful in ways that changed the shape of their days without either of them quite admitting how frightened they had become. They stopped meeting in the annex after curfew, choosing instead to spread their research across ordinary hours, tucked into corners of the main library where a passing professor's glance would find nothing more suspicious than two students studying together. Liam began walking her back to her dormitory each night, not asking permission so much as simply arriving at her side when classes ended, and Ivy, who had spent 3 years learning to need no one, found she did not mind the company nearly as much as she once would have expected to. It was during one of these ordinary evening walks that Ivy finally asked him something she had been circling for weeks. "What happens to you," she said, "if this is your mother? If we prove it, you'd be the one who exposed her." Liam was quiet long enough that she thought the question might have wounded him too deeply to answer. "I used to think loyalty to family meant never questioning it," he said eventually. "That was the whole architecture of how I was raised. Obedience first, always, because obedience was supposed to be the same thing as love." He glanced at her, something raw beneath his usual composure. "But I don't think that's true anymore. I think real loyalty means telling the truth even when it costs you the people you're supposed to be loyal to. If my mother did this, if she's responsible for what happened to your mother, for what almost happened to you, then protecting her isn't loyalty. It's just cowardice with better manners." The admission settled something in Ivy that she hadn't realized needed settling, some last quiet doubt about whether he would, in the end, choose his family's comfort over her survival when the moment finally arrived to choose. She did not say any of this aloud. She simply reached for his hand as they walked, and he did not let go until they reached her dormitory door. The days that followed brought smaller confirmations, each one sharpening the shape of the danger they were circling. A junior member of the Academy's groundskeeping staff, questioned quietly by Liam under the pretense of an assignment on local flora, confirmed that silverroot grew in exactly one carefully restricted plot on the mountain's northern face, land that had been designated, generations ago, for the private use of a single council family. Liam recognized the boundary markers the moment the groundskeeper described them. They belonged, unmistakably, to his mother's holdings. He did not tell Ivy immediately. He spent 2 sleepless nights turning the information over, testing it against every kinder explanation he could invent, before finally admitting to himself that there was no version of the truth that did not lead directly back to his own house. When he finally told her, sitting across from her at a corner table in the library with his voice pitched low enough not to carry, she watched something in him break quietly, privately, The particular grief of a person losing their last comfortable illusion about someone they had spent their whole life trying to earn approval from. I keep thinking there has to be another explanation, he admitted. That maybe someone else had access to that land. That maybe I'm wrong. You don't believe that, Ivy said gently, not unkindly. No, he admitted. I don't. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, an echo of the gesture he had offered her weeks earlier without either of them naming what it meant. I'm sorry, she said. I know this isn't what you wanted to find. I'd rather know, he said, even if it costs me everything I thought I understood about my own family, than keep living inside a lie the way everyone around us has been living inside one for a century. He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together with a quiet deliberateness that told her he had thought about it more than once before finally doing it. Whatever happens next, I want you to know I'm not choosing her over you. I never was going to. Outside the infirmary window, weeks earlier, the rain had continued, steady and indifferent, while somewhere in the administrative wing of the academy, Elira Thornvale reviewed a report on her son's recent movements with the calm, methodical patience of a woman who had buried far more inconvenient truths than one stubborn girl and her son's misplaced conscience, and began, carefully, to consider what would need to happen next. Chapter 9. The Council's Rotten Wing. The name came to them, in the end, not through the restricted annex, but through an old woman who ran a second-hand bookshop in the fishing village at the base of the mountain, a woman Ivy had known her whole life without ever once suspecting she held pieces of the truth Ivy had spent months chasing. Ivy had gone home for a short weekend leave, needing distance from the academy's watchful corridors more than she needed rest, and it was there, sitting in the cramped, dusty warmth of Mrs. Adair's shop while rain hammered the windows, that the old woman had looked at her for a long moment and said, unprompted, "You have your mother's eyes, you know. I always wondered if you'd grow into them." Ivy had gone very still. "You knew my mother. Knew her well enough." Mrs. Adair's gaze had turned distant, cautious, the look of someone deciding how much of an old secret was safe to hand over. Seraphine was kind. Quiet, in the way people are when they're carrying something heavy they can't set down. She used to come into the shop when she was pregnant with you, looking for books on the old bloodlines. I always assumed academic curiosity. I understand now she was probably looking for herself. What happened to her? Ivy's voice had come out barely above a whisper. The old woman had hesitated, weighing something before finally saying, quietly, "There was a man from the academy who used to meet her outside the village, always after dark, always careful about being seen. Well-dressed. Council robes, once, though he took care to hide them most of the time. I never learned his name, but I remember thinking, even then, that whatever they were to each other, it wasn't something either of them was allowed to have." It took another 2 weeks of careful searching, cross-referencing academy staff rosters against council attendance records from 18 years prior, before Liam finally found the name that matched every fragment they had gathered. Alden Dracath, a quiet, unremarkable council member who had sat, largely unnoticed, on the same board as Liam's mother for over 2 decades, his voting record so consistently cautious that no one had ever thought to look at him twice. "He's still here," Liam said, staring at the record with an unreadable expression. "Still on the council. Still walking these halls every week." Ivy felt something cold settle in her chest, a mixture of hope and dread so tangled together she couldn't separate them. "You think he's my father?" "I think," Liam said carefully, "there's only one way to find out." They found Alden Dracath alone in his study 3 nights later, a small, book-lined room in the council's administrative wing, lit by a single lamp that cast most of the space in shadow. He looked up when they entered without knocking, and Ivy watched something in his face shift the moment his eyes landed on her, recognition and grief and 17 years of careful, painful restraint all crossing his features at once before he had time to compose himself back into the careful blankness of a man who had spent decades hiding exactly this reaction. "You have her eyes," he said quietly, echoing Mrs. Adair's words almost exactly, and Ivy understood, in that instant, before he said anything else, that every suspicion she and Liam had built over months of careful searching was true. "Tell me what happened to her," Ivy said. Her voice shook despite her effort to keep it steady. "Tell me the truth. Not the official record. The truth." Alden set down the pen he had been holding, his hands trembling slightly, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, as though trying to memorize a face he had spent 17 years imagining without ever daring to seek out. "Your mother was the last known Miranai anyone in the council believed to be alive," he said finally. "I fell in love with her before I understood what that meant, before I understood the danger it put her in simply by existing near people like me. By the time I understood, it was already too late to protect either of us from what we'd started. And when I was born, the council found out." His voice had gone rough, the careful composure of decades finally cracking. "Not everyone. A small faction, the same faction that has always believed the bond's authority depends on no one ever proving it can be broken. They came for her while I was away at a council session I couldn't excuse myself from without raising suspicion. By the time I returned, she was gone. Officially missing. I've spent 17 years knowing, without proof, exactly what that word was covering for." "Why didn't you come for me?" The question came out harder than she intended, 17 years of unspoken abandonment finally finding a voice. "Why did you let me grow up thinking no one wanted me?" Alden's composure broke fully then, grief and guilt spilling into his voice in a way Ivy suspected he had never allowed himself to show anyone in 17 years. "Because the only way to keep you alive was to make sure no one, not even you, understood what you were," he said. "I placed you with a fishing family I trusted, far from the Academy's usual reach, and I made certain your files said nothing that would draw attention. Every year I watched you from a distance I never dared close, telling myself it was protection rather than cowardice, though some days I'm no longer certain there's a difference." He looked at her, eyes bright with unshed tears he was clearly unaccustomed to allowing himself. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I am only asking you to believe that everything I did because I could not survive losing you the way I lost her." Liam, standing quietly at Ivy's side through all of this, finally spoke. "There's a faction still active," he said. "Still trying to finish what they started with Seraphine. I think my mother is part of it." Something in Alden's face went very still. "Elira Thornvale has sat on that faction since before you were born," he said grimly. "I have long suspected her involvement in Seraphine's disappearance, though I've never had proof strong enough to bring before the full council. If she suspects Ivy is Miranai, and if she suspects you've been helping her, both of you are in far more danger than you understand." "There's a ceremony in 3 days," Liam said slowly, something working behind his eyes. "The Academy's founding commemoration. The whole council will be present. My mother will be presiding." Ivy felt the shape of an idea forming, dangerous and clarifying all at once. "Then that's where we end this," she said. "Not hiding anymore. Not letting them erase me quietly the way they erased my mother. If they want to bury the truth, they'll have to do it in front of everyone." Before they left to study that night, Alden rose from his desk and crossed to a small, locked cabinet in the corner of the room, retrieving a slim wooden box he handled with the particular care of something that had survived far longer than it should have. Inside, wrapped in a square of faded cloth, lay a simple silver ring, its band engraved with a pattern of waves so worn by time that it was nearly smooth, and a handful of letters tied together with string that had begun to fray at the knot. "These were hers," Alden said, his voice unsteady. "I kept them hidden even from myself most years, because looking at them meant admitting how much I'd lost by staying silent. I want you to have them now. Not because I think they can make up for 17 years. Only because I think you deserve to know who she was beyond the shape the council tried to erase her into." Ivy took the box carefully, feeling the weight of it settle in her hands as something far heavier than its size suggested. She did not open the letters that night, some instinct telling her they deserved a quieter moment than the one currently unfolding around her, one not shadowed by the urgency of a plan already taking shape. But she held the box against her chest as though it might, if she let go too soon, disappear the way everything else connected to her mother always had. "I want to know everything," she said. "Not tonight. But eventually. Every detail you remember. Every small thing that made her who she was, not just what happened to her." "I would like nothing more," Alden said, and something in his voice, worn thin by 17 years of careful silence, sounded almost like relief. Liam, who had stood quietly through the exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who had already begun calculating the risks of what came next. "If we're doing this at the ceremony," he said, "we need to be careful about how it happens. My mother has spent decades protecting the secret. She won't simply stand aside and let it unravel in front of the entire council without a fight." "She won't have a choice," Alden said grimly. "Not once the water speaks for itself. The old elders on the council, the ones who still remember the teachings from before the records were sealed, will recognize what they're seeing the moment it happens. Elira can silence official records. She cannot silence memory that's simply been dormant, waiting for a reason to surface again." They spent the following 3 days in careful, quiet preparation, Alden quietly gathering what remaining evidence he had kept hidden over the years, correspondence, old council minutes he had never turned over, anything that might corroborate the truth once it was spoken aloud in front of witnesses too powerful to be easily silenced afterward. Liam, for his part, spent long hours in uneasy conversation with his father, a man who had spent decades deferring to his wife's political instincts without ever fully understanding the darker currents running beneath them, trying to gauge how much support they might expect once the truth became impossible to ignore. Ivy spent those same 3 days doing the harder, quieter work of preparing herself, not for the confrontation itself, which frightened her less now than it once might have, but for the version of her own life that would exist afterward, whatever shape that turned out to take. She read her mother's letters late at night, slowly, savoring each one, learning in Seraphine's careful, looping handwriting about a woman who had loved the sea the same way Ivy did, who had once written, in a letter meant for a daughter she would never meet, that she hoped whoever came after her would never have to hide the parts of themselves that made them extraordinary. Alden looked at his daughter for a long moment, something fierce and frightened and, beneath both, unmistakably proud moving across his face. "Your mother would have done exactly the same thing," he said quietly. "She never did know how to stay hidden when it mattered most." Chapter 10. The Tide That Would Not Be Buried. The founding commemoration was the single largest gathering the Academy held each year, a ceremony older than most of the families who attended it, staged in the Great Hall beneath banners bearing the crests of every pack bound by the old alliances. Council members sat along a raised dais at the hall's far end, Elira Thornvale among them in robes so precisely tailored they looked less like clothing than armor, her expression composed into the same serene authority she had worn Ivy's entire life without Ivy ever once understanding what it concealed. Ivy stood near the back of the crowded hall in a plain gray dress, Liam close beside her, both of them aware that what they were about to do could not be undone once it began. Alden had taken his usual seat among the council, his face carefully neutral, though Ivy caught the tension in his shoulders even from across the crowded room, the strain of a man about to publicly unravel 17 years of careful concealment. The ceremony proceeded as it always had, speeches about tradition, about the bond's unbroken strength, about the enduring loyalty that held the mountain packs together across generations. Ivy listened to every word with a new and bitter clarity, understanding now exactly how much of that unbroken strength had depended on making sure no one ever learned it could be broken at all. It was during the ceremonial lighting of the founding basin, a wide stone bowl filled with water drawn each year from the same ancient spring and set beneath the hall's tall windows to catch the rising moon, that Ivy stepped forward from the crowd before she had fully decided to move. A murmur rippled through the hall as heads turned toward her, the girl no one expected to see standing so deliberately at the center of everyone's attention. Elira Thornvale's composed expression flickered, just once, quickly smoothed over, but not quickly enough to escape the notice of a girl who had spent 3 years learning to read every small crack in a mask. "I think," Ivy said, her voice carrying further than she expected in the sudden hush, "that this ceremony has been built on a lie for almost a century, and I think most of you standing here don't even know it." The murmur sharpened into something closer to alarm. Somewhere near the dais, Elira rose halfway from her seat before catching herself, forcing her expression back into careful composure. "This is neither the time nor the place for a student's grievances," she said, her voice pitched to carry the calm, dismissive authority of someone accustomed to ending conversations simply by declaring them over. "It's exactly the time," Ivy said, "because you've spent decades making sure there was never a place at all." She walked to the fountain basin, aware of every eye in the hall following her, aware of Liam moving to stand at the base of the dais, where he could be seen clearly by every council member present, a silent, deliberate statement of alliance that she knew would cost him more than she could fully repay. She looked down at the moonlit water, cold and still, and catching the light exactly the way the pool at Nightmare Manor had months before, and let herself, for the first time, stop fighting whatever lived inside her. The change came faster this time, as though the power inside her had been waiting, restless, for permission rather than accident. Her eyes flooded silver. The air around the basin shimmered, and the water itself seemed to rise, not spilling over the bowl's edge, but lifting in a slow, deliberate column that caught the moonlight and held it, refracting it across the stunned faces of the entire hall. Within that column, for one suspended moment, the shape that had flickered briefly in the pool months earlier became fully, unmistakably visible, ancient and fluid and undeniably real, before settling back into the ordinary shape of a girl standing very still with silver eyes and water curling gently around her outstretched hands. The hall had gone utterly silent. "My name is Ivy Calder," she said into that silence, her voice steady despite the trembling she could feel in every part of her body. "For 3 years, this academy called me empty because I never shifted the way the rest of you did. I believed it myself for a long time, but I was never empty. I am Miranai, the last of a bloodline your council decided, nearly a century ago, was too dangerous to let the rest of you know still existed. Because if you knew a Miranai could exist, you'd have to ask yourselves whether the bond you've all been taught to believe is unbreakable was ever really unbreakable at all." Chaos began to ripple through the crowd, whispers rising into open exclamations, but Ivy did not stop. "My mother was Miranai too," she continued, louder now. "Her name was Seraphine Winmere. She did not go missing. She was murdered by a faction of this council determined to protect a lie, and I believe that faction is still active, still sitting among you tonight." Elira Thornvale had gone very pale on the dais, her composure cracking at last into something colder and far more dangerous. "This is madness," she said, though her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "A girl making wild accusations, using some cheap party trick with water, expects the council to simply—" "It's not a party trick," Liam said, cutting across his mother's words with a clarity that silenced the hall more effectively than anything else had that night. Every head turned toward him, the heir of Thornvale standing at the base of the dais, publicly contradicting his own mother in front of the assembled leadership of every pack on the continent. "I've spent months investigating this with her. Sealed records. Erased genealogies. A poisoning that nearly killed her 3 weeks ago, using a compound that only grows on council-protected land. I think you know exactly what she is, Mother, because I think you've known since the night you saw us together in the garden." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Elira's mouth opened, then closed, her carefully constructed composure finally, publicly, failing her in front of the entire council she had spent decades manipulating from within. It was Alden who rose next, his voice heavy with the weight of 17 years finally set down. "I can confirm everything my daughter has said," he said, and the word daughter, spoken aloud for the first time in Ivy's life, seemed to echo through the stunned hall louder than anything else that had been said that night. "I was Seraphine Winmere's partner. I am Ivy's father. And I have long suspected, though I lacked the courage until tonight to say it openly, that certain members of this council were responsible for her death and have spent decades since maintaining that silence through whatever means necessary." The hall dissolved into open uproar, council members rising from their seats, voices rising over one another, decades of careful order collapsing in the space of a few devastating minutes. Elira Thornvale, recognizing the crumbling ground beneath her, made one final attempt at composure, drawing herself up to address the crowd with the authority of a lifetime spent commanding rooms. "Even if any of this were true," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with practiced sharpness, "a single girl's claim, however dramatic, is not evidence enough to—" The water in the fountain basin surged again behind Ivy, responding, it seemed, to something in her that had stopped needing permission entirely, and this time the shape within it held longer, clearer, ancient and undeniable in a way that no amount of council authority could argue away. Several older members of the assembly, elders who had studied the oldest texts long before the sealed records had ever been sealed, went very still, recognition dawning on faces too experienced to dismiss what they were seeing as mere trickery. "I remember the old teachings," one elder said slowly, rising from her seat near the dais, her voice trembling with something between fear and wonder. "My grandmother spoke of the Miranai when I was a child, before the stories were forbidden. She said we would know one when the water itself began to remember an older shape." She looked at Elira with dawning, horrified understanding. "You knew this was possible. You've always known." The tide of the room had turned, decisively and irreversibly, and Elira Thornvale, watching decades of careful concealment collapse in real time before the very council she had once controlled, understood with sudden, brutal clarity that there was no version of the night ahead that ended with her secret intact. In the days that followed, the investigation the council was finally forced to open uncovered exactly what Ivy and Liam had spent months suspecting. Evidence of Seraphine Winmere's murder, buried but never fully destroyed. Records of a decades-long faction dedicated to erasing any proof that the bond could be broken, its membership including several senior council figures alongside Elira Thornvale, all of whom were formally stripped of their positions and titles once the full weight of the evidence became impossible to deny. The silverroot compound used to poison Ivy was traced directly to land under Elira's personal stewardship, closing the final gap in a case that had taken 17 years to finally come fully into the light. Alden Dracath, though his own silence had cost him more than he could easily forgive himself for, was permitted to remain on the council, his testimony and evidence instrumental in dismantling the faction that had operated in the shadows for so long. He and Ivy did not become, overnight, the easy, uncomplicated family either of them might once have wished for. 17 years of absence could not be undone in a single confrontation, however dramatic. But he began carefully, patiently, to earn back the trust his fear had cost him, and Ivy found, slowly, that she was willing to let him try. Liam's relationship with his mother fractured in ways that would take years, if ever, to fully heal, though he found, in the aftermath, that the loss weighed less heavily than he had once feared it would. He had spent his whole life organizing his choices around other people's expectations. For the first time, standing in the wreckage of an alliance that had governed every plan made for his future since before he was born, he found himself free to choose something else entirely. He found Ivy weeks later at the edge of the same pool where everything had begun, the water calm now beneath an ordinary evening sky, no lanterns, no crowd, no cruelty waiting beneath the surface of anyone's smile. She sat at the water's edge with her feet bare against the cool stone, watching the last light fade behind the mountains, and she did not startle when he sat down beside her, close enough now that the distance between them had become an old habit neither of them still needed. "Everyone still stares at me in the halls," she said quietly. "Just differently now. Give it time." He watched the water instead of her, though she could feel his attention anyway, steady and warm beside her. "They'll find something else to whisper about eventually. They always do. And you." She turned to look at him properly. "Your whole future just came apart in front of everyone who mattered to your family. Are you all right?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things before answering. "For the first time in my life, I think I actually am," he said. "I spent 17 years being told exactly who I was supposed to become. I'd rather not know yet who I'm going to be, if it means I get to choose it myself." The water lapped gently against the stone edge, ordinary and unremarkable, nothing stirring beneath its surface tonight, but reflected starlight. Ivy reached out, almost without meaning to, and let her fingers brush the back of his hand where it rested on the cool stone between them, and he turned his palm upward to meet hers, an answer neither of them needed to put into words. "For 3 years," she said quietly, "I thought I was the only thing in this academy that didn't fit anywhere. Turns out I just hadn't found the one place I was always supposed to be standing." He looked at her then, really looked, in the unhurried, deliberate way he had looked at her the very first night beside a different pool, the night he had decided, without quite understanding why, that she was worth choosing. "Neither did I," he said, "until I found you." She thought, in that quiet moment, of every version of this night she might have imagined for herself back when she was still the girl no one at Aldervane had ever bothered to look at twice, the version where she stayed small and careful and unnoticed for the rest of her life, grateful simply not to be hurt further. She was glad, fiercely and without reservation, that this was not the story that had found her instead. The kiss that followed was quiet, unhurried, nothing like the dramatic collapse of secrets and counsels and decades of careful lies that had brought them to this particular evening. It was simply two people who had spent months learning to trust each other in the dark, finally choosing, in the light, to stay. In the months that followed, the academy itself began, slowly, to change shape around the truth it could no longer pretend not to know. The restricted annex, once guarded so carefully against the very history it had been built to conceal, was reopened under new stewardship. Its sealed shelves catalogued properly for the first time in nearly a century, the gaps in its records finally, painstakingly, filled back in wherever fragments could still be recovered. Younger students, the same ones who had once whispered the word empty in dormitory corridors after lights out, began instead to whisper a different word entirely, Miranai, spoken now with something closer to awe than cruelty, though Ivy found she still flinched sometimes at being spoken of at all, old habits slower to unlearn than old wounds were to heal. Vesper, in the strange, unhurried way people sometimes surprise you, became something like a friend over that following year, not close in the easy way Ivy had once imagined friendship might feel, but real in its own careful, hard-won fashion, built from an honesty neither of them had expected to find on the other side of so much old damage. She and Liam did not marry, in the end, a fact that surprised no one, least of all their families, who had spent the year since the ceremony rebuilding their own understanding of what alliance could mean when it wasn't built on obligation alone. Alden Dracath remained on the council, chastened but steady, spending as much time as Ivy would allow him piecing together, letter by letter and memory by memory, the shape of the woman he had loved and lost and the daughter he had spent 17 years watching from too great a distance. It was not, in the end, the relationship either of them might once have wished for if the world had simply been kinder from the start. But it was real, and it grew steadier with each season that passed, rooted in an honesty that had cost them both dearly enough to make sure neither would waste it again. Ivy never did learn to summon her power at will, the way the other shifters at Aldervane summoned theirs through discipline and long practice. It remained, as the old texts had promised, something that answered only to water and moonlight, arriving unbidden in its own time rather than on command. She stopped minding this, eventually, coming to understand it not as a flaw in her but as simply the particular shape her inheritance had always been meant to take, ancient and unhurried, and entirely her own. On quiet evenings, when the moon caught the surface of the lake below the academy just right, she would sometimes walk down to the water's edge alone and stand there for a long while, watching the light move across the current, thinking of a mother she had never known and a name that had nearly been erased forever, and feeling, each time, a little more certain that she had finally found her way home to exactly the life she had always been meant to claim.